They said it was the cruelest thing Walter Grimes had ever done. Nora Callahan stood in that lawyer's office with her two children clinging to her sides, watching her brother and sister laugh at a piece of paper that was supposed to change her life, and all she could do was stare at the single rusted key sitting on the table in front of her. A $9 farmhouse. A condemned, rotting structure in the middle of nowhere, Tennessee that nobody wanted, nobody could sell, and everyone agreed should have been torn down a decade ago. But what nobody in that room could have predicted, what nobody who drove past 22 Dustmill Road on those long, empty country roads could have imagined, was that inside the crumbling walls of that forgotten farmhouse was something so extraordinary, so impossible, so completely hidden from the world that it would not only make Nora rich, but leave an entire county speechless. Stay with me until the end of this story, because the moment her brother and sister finally walked through that farmhouse door and saw what Nora had uncovered, their expression said everything words never could. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The law office of Hawkins and Briggs sat on the second floor of a narrow brick building on the main street of Clarksville, Tennessee. It was the kind of office that smelled like old paper and furniture polish, with framed certificates on the walls, and a receptionist who spoke in a careful whisper as though the whole building was always in the middle of something serious. On the morning of March 14th, Nora Callahan sat in a chair that felt too stiff and too formal for someone wearing a secondhand sweater and boots held together with electrical tape. She was 36 years old. Her dark auburn hair was pulled back with a rubber band she'd found in the bottom of her bag. To her left sat Chloe, 9 years old, quietly drawing shapes on a notepad the receptionist had given her. To her right, Ben, 6 years old, leaning against Nora's arm with the kind of exhausted stillness that children get when they've been moving too much and sleeping too little. Nora's father, Walter Grimes, had died 5 weeks earlier. 71 years old, a stroke in the early morning, gone before the ambulance arrived. He'd been a quiet and complicated man, a former tobacco farmer who'd spent the last 20 years of his life bouncing between small properties in rural Tennessee, buying things cheap, selling them cheaper, never quite building the life he seemed to always be reaching for. Nora had been the one who'd driven 4 hours every few months to check on him, who'd organized his medications after his first minor stroke 3 years ago, who'd sat with him through 2 hospitalizations and helped him understand the paperwork the doctors handed him. She hadn't done it expecting anything in return. She'd done it because he was her father and because nobody else was doing it. Her siblings, Raymond and Sylvia, had their own lives. Raymond, 43, ran a moderately successful landscaping company in Nashville and had a talent for making his absence sound like a sacrifice. Sylvia, 41, had married into a comfortable life in Chattanooga and communicated mainly through brief text messages and the occasional birthday card that arrived 3 days late. Neither of them had visited Walter in the last 2 years of his life. Nora knew this not because anyone had told her, but because every time she arrived at her father's small rental house, the guest room was always exactly as she'd left it from her last visit. Same folded towel on the bed. Same half-empty bottle of water on the nightstand. Attorney Theodore Hawkins was a compact man in his late 60s with silver reading glasses and the careful, measured energy of someone who had delivered difficult news many times and had learned that the best way to do it was steadily and without apology. He read the will in the order it was written. Raymond received the savings account, which held $47,000. He also received the 2019 Ford pickup truck and a collection of antique farm tools Walter had stored in a rented unit. Sylvia received the investment portfolio, modest but real, valued at approximately $62,000. She also received Walter's personal property, his furniture, his books, his watches, the few pieces of jewelry their mother had left behind. Raymond exhaled with quiet satisfaction. Sylvia allowed herself a small smile and wrote something in the leather notebook she'd brought, already calculating. Neither of them looked at Nora. Hawkins paused before continuing. He removed his glasses, cleaned them once with the cloth from his breast pocket, replaced them. Then he looked at Nora with an expression she would remember for the rest of her life. Not pity exactly, but something close to it. Something that knew what was coming. To my daughter Nora, I leave the property located at 22 Dustmill Road, Harlan County, Tennessee. The farmhouse, all structures on the land, all contents therein, and the 3.4 acres on which it stands. Raymond laughed first. It started as a short sound, controlled, like he was trying not to, and then it wasn't controlled at all. Sylvia put her hand over her mouth, but her shoulders were shaking. Nora sat very still. "What's the Dustmill property?" she asked quietly. "Dad bought it at a tax auction about 8 years ago," Raymond said, wiping his eye. "Paid $9 for it. Literally $9 because nobody else wanted it. He always talked about fixing it up someday. He never did. The county has been after him for years to either renovate it or demolish it. It's condemned," Sylvia added, composing herself. "There was a fire years ago, partial damage to one side. The roof has sections that have caved in. I think there might even be a structural violation notice on the property." She looked at Nora with something dressed up as sympathy. "It's basically a liability." Hawkins produced a manila envelope and slid it across the table. Inside were documents and a key. Old iron, dark with age, heavier than it looked. "There is one condition," Hawkins said. "The property cannot be sold for a period of 18 months from the date of Walter Grimes' passing. After that period, you're free to sell or dispose of it as you see fit." 18 months, Raymond muttered. "You'll be paying property taxes on a condemned building you can't unload." Sylvia leaned forward with an offer already rehearsed. "When the 18 months are up, we'll take it off your hands. We can probably do 10, maybe 15,000, enough to cover whatever you've spent on it by then." 15,000 for a condemned farmhouse on 3.4 acres of Harlan County land that her father had paid $9 for. The contempt in it was breathtaking. Nora picked up the key. She held it in her palm. It was cold and solid, and it fit her hand in a way that felt strangely deliberate. "Why would he do this?" she asked, not to Raymond or Sylvia, but to Hawkins, the only person in the room she felt she could trust with the question. Hawkins looked at her carefully. "He told me that each of his children was receiving exactly what they deserved and exactly what they needed. He said you in particular would understand what to do with it, even if you didn't know that yet. You were always the responsible one," Raymond said, standing and buttoning his jacket. "The one who showed up." He patted her shoulder once in a way that managed to feel like a dismissal. But responsible doesn't always mean rewarded. He and Sylvia left together, already talking about next steps, estate logistics, the truck, the investment account. Hawkins gathered his papers. He handed Nora a second document, a property survey, a county inspection notice, and a photograph. The photograph showed a 2-story farmhouse set back from a gravel road. White paint peeling in long strips. A porch leaning away from the front of the house at a troubling angle. One upstairs window boarded with plywood. A handwritten "No Trespassing" sign stapled to a post at the edge of the overgrown yard. Nora sat alone at the mahogany table with an envelope, a key, a photograph, and 2 children who had quietly fallen asleep in their chairs without anyone noticing. She looked at the photograph for a long time. She had nowhere to go. She and the children had been living out of her 2009 Honda Civic for 6 weeks. Since the apartment in Memphis she'd rented with her caregiver's salary had become unaffordable the week after her last client passed away. She had $214 in her bank account, 2 children, a car with a slow leak in the rear left tire, and now a condemned farmhouse in a county she'd never been to. Her brother thought it was a joke. Her sister thought it was an insult. But Nora Callahan looked at that photograph and saw something neither of them had looked closely enough to notice. Through all the damage and the decay, through the peeling paint and the leaning porch and the boarded windows, the structure of that house was still standing. Whatever had been done to it, whatever years of neglect and a fire and a Tennessee winter had thrown at it, the walls were still there. And sometimes Nora thought, closing her fingers around the key, the walls are the whole point. She woke Chloe and Ben gently, put her arms around them both in the parking lot outside Hawkins and Briggs, held them for a moment in the cold morning air. Then she buckled them into the back seat, typed 22 Dustmill Road in her phone, and started the car. They had a farmhouse to see. The drive to Harlan County took just under 2 hours. Nora drove with the kind of focused quiet that had become her default state over the past 6 weeks. The radio off, her eyes on the road, her mind running through numbers and possibilities the way it always did when she had no good options and needed to find one anyway. Chloe sat in the back reading a library book she checked out 3 towns ago and never returned. Ben had fallen back asleep with his cheek pressed against the window and his mouth slightly open. Outside, Nashville's edges gave way to smaller towns, then smaller still, and eventually to the long flat stretches of rural Tennessee where the landscape opened up into fields and tree lines and the occasional farmhouse set so far back from the road it looked like it was trying not to be seen. Nora had grown up in a small town not far from here. She knew this kind of country. She knew the way silence sat differently in places like this, heavier and more honest than city silence. She knew the smell of red clay after rain and the particular quality of light on an open field in early spring. There was something about driving into this landscape that felt less like arriving somewhere new and more like returning somewhere she'd left without meaning to. The GPS directed her off the main highway onto a county road, then off that onto a gravel road that ran between 2 overgrown fields. A rusted mailbox leaned at the edge of the property, the numbers 22 barely visible beneath a skin of brown corrosion. Nora turned in slowly. The gravel crunched under the tires. She drove perhaps 100 yards before the farmhouse came into full view, and she stopped the car completely. The photograph Hawkins had given her had not done it justice. In the photograph, distance had softened things. In person, there was no softening. The farmhouse was 2 stories of weathered white wood sitting on a low stone foundation, and it looked like it had been slowly losing an argument with time for the better part of 30 years. The front porch had separated from a main structure on the left side and tilted toward the ground at an angle that suggested the next significant wind might finish the job. Every window on the ground floor was either boarded with plywood or broken entirely, the glass long gone, the frames dark with moisture damage. The fire that Sylvia had mentioned had taken most of the right side of the second floor. The exterior wall up there was blackened and bowed outward, and a section of roof above it had collapsed inward, leaving a ragged open wound in the roofline that exposed dark rafters to the sky. Weeds had taken the yard completely. A collapsed fence ran along the left side of the property, its posts rotted at the base and lying in the grass like something that had simply given up. Behind the house, Nora could see the outline of a barn, or what had been a barn, now mostly a skeleton of gray timber. An old county notice stapled to a wooden stake near the drive read condemnation order in bold black letters. Faded, but legible, the county seal still visible. Ben had woken up during the slow drive-in. He pressed his face against the window and stared. "Is that our house?" he asked. Nora looked at it for a long moment before answering. "It's going to be," she said. Chloe looked up from her book. "It looks broken." "It is," Nora said, "but broken things can be fixed." She said it with more certainty than she felt, because that was what you did when your children were watching you decide whether to be afraid. She got out of the car and walked toward the house slowly. The yard was wet from recent rain, and the weeds soaked her boots to the ankle within the first few steps. She walked the perimeter first, the way she'd learned to do when assessing her father's properties during his illness, going all the way around before going in, looking at the foundation, the roof line, the exterior walls. The stone foundation was old but solid, the mortar crumbling in places, but the stones themselves massive and unmoved. The walls on the left side and the front of the house, away from the fire damage, were structurally intact. The wood was soft in places, but the framing beneath was holding. The porch was cosmetic damage, serious looking but not structural. The right side and part of the rear were a different story. The fire had done real work there, and the subsequent years of exposure had done more. But the bones were there. Nora stood at the back of the property and looked at the house from a distance, and made herself see it not as it was but as it could be. Large windows, good proportions, a generous footprint, 3.4 acres of land with a creek she could hear but not yet see running along the back edge of the property. A barn that was damaged but not gone. She walked back to the car and got the key from the envelope. The front door was padlocked with a chain that had rusted nearly through. She didn't even need the bolt cutters she'd stopped to buy on the way. She applied steady pressure, and the chain gave it a dry snap. She used the old iron key in the door lock. It resisted, grinding with rust, and then turned with a deep mechanical click that echoed off the porch boards. Nora pushed the door open. The smell came first. Damp wood, ash, old earth, and something underneath it all that she couldn't name yet, something dry and faintly sweet, like old paper or cedar. She stood in the doorway and let her eyes adjust to the dimness inside. Chloe and Ben appeared at her sides, one under each arm, looking in with her. The three of them stood there together at the threshold of a condemned farmhouse in Harlan County, Tennessee, with $200 in the bank and nowhere else to go. Nora took a breath, and she stepped inside. The inside of the farmhouse was darker than the outside had prepared her for. Nora moved through the entrance slowly, phone flashlight cutting through the dimness, Chloe and Ben staying close behind her. The entry hall was narrow, maybe 4 feet wide, with a low ceiling and walls covered in peeling wallpaper, a faded floral pattern in yellow and green that had bubbled and separated from the plaster in long, curling strips. The floor was wide plank wood, buried under a layer of debris, plaster dust, leaves blown in through broken windows, and the scattered remains of what had once been furniture. A wooden chair with 3 legs, a broken picture frame, glass long gone, its backing swollen with moisture. Nora tested each step carefully before committing her weight. The boards flexed but held. She moved into what had been the main living room and stopped. Even through the damage, the room was larger than she'd expected. Ceilings ran higher than typical farmhouse construction, maybe 10 feet, which was unusual for a rural Tennessee property of this age. The fireplace on the far wall was brick, floor to ceiling, wide enough to stand in, its mantel still intact, though coated in thick gray dust. 2 windows flanked it, both boarded from the outside but large, their frames showing the width and height that would flood this room with light if the boards ever came down. She moved through to the kitchen. Smaller, practical, with a cast-iron wood-burning stove still standing against the back wall, heavy and dark and entirely solid. The counters were rotted through in places, and the sink had pulled away from the wall, but the room's layout was sensible and the exterior wall showed no structural compromise. A back door led out to what had been a small covered porch, and beyond it the yard and the barn. The door hung crooked in its frame, but opened when Nora lifted it slightly and pushed. The right side of the house she approached carefully. The fire damage was concentrated here in what had been a sitting room or study, and the ceiling above it had partially collapsed, bringing down sections of the second floor with it. Nora did not go far into this room. She stood at its entrance, assessed, and stepped back. This was not where she would start. This was a problem for later, for when she had more knowledge and more resources and more of a plan. The staircase to the second floor was along the left interior wall, away from the fire damage, and it surprised her. The treads were wide and solid, cut from thick timber that had barely shifted in however many decades this house had been standing. Nora went up slowly, hand on the wall, testing. The second floor was divided into 3 rooms. The 2 toward the right side of the house showed smoke damage, and in one case a section of collapsed roof that let in a column of gray afternoon light. But the left side bedroom was untouched by the fire. Small, square, with a single window looking out over the fields, its floor dusty but level, its walls intact. This would be their room, at least for now. That evening, Nora made up 2 sleeping areas on the floor using blankets from the car. She found a section of the kitchen floor that was solid and swept it clean with a branch she pulled from the yard, and they ate crackers and peanut butter by the light of her phone. Ben fell asleep quickly the way he always did, completely and without argument. Chloe lay on her back, looking at the ceiling for a long time before she spoke. "Mom," she said quietly, "are we going to be okay?" Nora lay beside her in the dark. She looked at the ceiling too. "Yes," she said. "I promise you we are." The first week was about survival and assessment. Nora drove into the nearest town, a small place called Millbrook, 12 miles down the county road, and bought the cheapest cleaning supplies she could find. Broom, mop, garbage bags, a box of basic tools, a utility knife. She spent 2 days doing nothing but removing debris from the ground floor, bag after bag carried out and piled at the edge of the property. She found rhythm in the work the same way she always had in physical labor, the kind of rhythm that quiets the thinking mind and lets the body take over. She set up a camp stove on the kitchen counter for heating water and simple meals. She located the water shutoff and the electrical panel, both disconnected, both needing professional attention before either could be safely restored. She patched 2 broken ground floor windows with plastic sheeting and duct tape to keep wind and animals out. She propped the front porch supports with lumber she found in the barn. Not a fix, but enough to stop the lean from getting worse before she could address it properly. By the end of the first week, the ground floor was clear of debris, and she could walk through every room without stepping over something. The house felt different when it was clean. It breathed differently. It had a quality she hadn't been able to feel through all the mess, something solid and purposeful in the way it was laid out, the way each room connected to the next. It was during the second week that it started. Nora was in the living room, running her hand along the wall beside the fireplace, checking the plaster for soft spots that might indicate water damage or structural issues behind it. She pressed her palm flat against the wall and felt it. Not softness, not damage, something else entirely. A seam, straight, deliberate, running vertically from about knee height to above her head. Not a crack, not settling. A seam that had been plastered over and painted, intentionally concealed, but unmistakably there. She pressed harder. The wall gave slightly, not collapsing, but flexing in a way that solid plaster over solid framing should not flex. Nora stepped back and looked at the wall with completely different eyes. She ran her flashlight along it slowly, and now that she was looking, she could see it. A rectangle, roughly 3 feet wide and 5 feet tall, plastered and painted to match the surrounding wall so closely that you would never notice it unless you were looking for something wrong. Someone had put something behind that wall, and someone had gone to considerable effort to make sure nobody would ever know it was there. Nora stood very still in the quiet farmhouse with her flashlight on that rectangle of wall and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not fear, not desperation. Something closer to the feeling you get at the very beginning of something, when you don't yet know what it is, but every instinct you have is telling you to pay attention. She went to find a hammer. The hammer was an old one she'd found in the barn, its handle worn smooth from decades of use, its head solid and heavy. Nora stood before that plastered rectangle in the living room wall and held it for a long moment before she swung. The first strike punched through the plaster easily, sending a small cloud of white dust into the air. She pulled the hammer back and swung again, widening the hole. Then she stopped and shone her flashlight into the gap she'd made. Behind the plaster was not insulation or framing or the dark, empty cavity she'd expected. Behind the plaster was wood. Old wood, dark with age, fitted together with careful precision. Planks running horizontally, smooth and close-joined, clearly not structural. Clearly something built deliberately and then hidden. Nora worked carefully now, removing plaster in sections rather than swinging hard, pulling chunks away with her hands and setting them down quietly as though the noise might disturb whatever was back there. It took 20 minutes to clear enough plaster to understand what she was looking at. It was a cabinet, built directly into the wall cavity, framed out and fitted with horizontal shelves, running the full height and width of the rectangle she'd identified. The wood was dark walnut, old growth, dense and fine-grained in a way that modern lumber simply wasn't. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Each shelf was level and smooth, fitted with wooden pegs rather than nails, the joinery tight and clean even after what must have been decades sealed inside that wall. And on the shelves, wrapped carefully in cloth that had gone stiff and brown with age, were objects. Nora reached in and lifted the nearest one, unwrapped it slowly. It was a glass bottle, dark amber, hand-blown, with an irregular shape that no machine had ever made. She set it down carefully and reached for another. A ceramic pitcher, cream-colored with a blue-painted pattern around its middle, the kind of folk art pottery that American craftsmen made in the early 1800s. Another cloth revealed a small wooden box with a brass latch, and inside it, nested in deteriorated velvet, a collection of antique coins. She lifted one to her flashlight. The date stamped into the metal read 1847. She sat back on her heels and looked at what was in front of her. She was not an antiques expert. She had no particular knowledge of collectibles or historical artifacts. But she understood enough to understand that what she was looking at was not junk. These objects had been wrapped carefully and hidden deliberately. Someone had built a concealed cabinet inside a wall of this farmhouse and filled it with things they considered worth protecting. The question was when and why, and what exactly she was holding. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Chloe appeared in the doorway, while Nora was still kneeling on the floor, surrounded by unwrapped objects. Her eyes went wide. What is all that? She came and crouched beside her mother, picking up the ceramic pitcher carefully with both hands the way she handled things she understood were fragile. It was hidden, Nora said, behind the wall. Someone hid all of this inside the wall a very long time ago. Ben came in behind his sister, saw the hole in the plaster, and immediately wanted to help make it bigger. Nora redirected him to holding the flashlight instead, which he accepted with great seriousness. They spent the rest of that afternoon documenting everything. Nora photographed each object before and after unwrapping it, using her phone with the flashlight propped against the wall to get clear images. The cabinet held 23 objects in total. Glass bottles of various sizes, all hand-blown. For pieces of ceramic pottery, each hand-painted. The coin collection, which alone contained over 60 individual coins, ranging in date from the 1820s to the 1880s. A small oil lamp with an intact glass chimney. 2 hand-carved wooden figures, folk art, one a horse and one a human figure, both showing exceptional detail. And at the very back of the lowest shelf, wrapped in 2 layers of cloth, and then in a piece of old leather tied with a cord, a journal. The journal was small, bound in brown leather gone dark and stiff with age. Nora untied the cord with careful fingers and opened it to the first page. The handwriting was neat and deliberate, in the style of someone who'd learned penmanship formally in an earlier era. The ink had faded to a pale brown, but was entirely legible. At the top of the first page, in careful letters, a name. Elias Greer, and below it a date. April 1888. Nora sat on the dusty floor of the farmhouse with her 2 children on either side of her and read the first entry by the light of her phone. The voice that came off those pages was precise and careful. The voice of a man who chose his words deliberately and meant every one of them. Elias Greer had been a craftsman, a furniture maker and woodworker who had built this farmhouse with his own hands in 1871 and lived in it for the rest of his life. He had never married. He had no children. And in the spring of 1888, sensing that his health was failing, he had made a decision about the objects he'd collected and made over a lifetime of skilled work. He had decided to hide them, not out of fear exactly, but out of what he called in his own words a desire to keep them from those who would sell them without understanding what they were. He believed the right person would find them eventually. He wrote that he had faith in the house to hold them until that person came. He listed every object he'd placed in the cabinet, described each one, recorded where several of the pieces had come from and what they'd cost him in time and material and care. Nora read slowly, turning pages with the tips of her fingers. When she finished the last entry, she sat quietly for a long moment. Then she looked at the objects arranged on the floor around her and understood something that made her breath catch. These weren't just old things. Elias Greer had been a craftsman of serious skill working in a period when American folk art and handmade objects were produced at a quality that the modern world had largely stopped creating. The coins alone, based on the dates and the brief description she could find by searching her phone in the weak signal available out here, could be worth significant money. The pottery, the glass, the carved figures, the lamp. She needed an expert. She needed someone who knew what they were looking at. But sitting there on the floor of a farmhouse her father had bought for $9, reading the journal of a man who had died over a century ago and trusted his house to keep his life's work safe, Nora Callahan felt something shift inside her chest. Her father had known. He had to have known. Walter Grimes had bought this property at a tax auction, and he had never done anything with it, had never renovated it or sold it or even mentioned it to her directly. But he had left it to her, specifically and deliberately to her. Not to Raymond, who would have sold it immediately. Not to Sylvia, who would have hired someone to clear it out without looking at anything carefully. To her, the one who showed up, the one who paid attention, the one who could see what things were worth when nobody else was bothering to look. She closed the journal gently and held it in both hands. Outside the farmhouse windows, the Tennessee fields were going gold in the late afternoon light. Ben had fallen asleep against her arm. Chloe was examining the hand-carved horse with quiet concentration, turning it slowly in her hands, tracing the lines of it with one finger. Nora looked at her daughter and thought about Elias Greer sealing up that cabinet in 1888 and writing in his journal that the right person would come. She thought about her father paying $9 for a condemned farmhouse and leaving it to the only one of his children who would have walked through the door instead of away from it. Sometimes the most important things in a person's life arrive, disguised as nothing at all. The morning after finding Elias Greer's hidden cabinet, Nora drove into Millbrook with the journal, 3 of the ceramic pieces carefully wrapped in clean cloth, and the coin collection sealed in a Ziploc bag she'd found in the glove compartment of her car. She'd searched online the night before using the farmhouse's weak signal and found an antiques dealer in town named Harlan Collectibles, a small shop on the main street that had been operating for over 30 years according to its faded window lettering. The owner, a compact and precise woman in her late 60s named Beverly Marsh, looked at what Nora said on her counter and went very still in the way that people with genuine expertise go still when they encounter something that commands their full attention. Beverly examined each ceramic piece under a magnifying glass without speaking. She turned the coins over one by one, setting certain ones aside in a separate careful pile. She read 3 pages of Elias Greer's journal with the focused expression of someone reading something that mattered. Then she took off her magnifying glass and looked at Nora directly. "Where did you get these?" Nora told her. "The farmhouse on Dustmill Road." Beverly looked at her for a long moment. "Walter Grimes' property?" "Yes," Nora said. "He was my father. He left it to me." Beverly sat down on the stool behind her counter. She was quiet for long enough that Nora began to feel uncertain. Then Beverly said, "The ceramic pieces are Tennessee pottery, mid-1800s, regional folk art from a tradition that produced very few surviving examples in this condition. The coins include several that are genuinely rare, a couple I'd want a specialist to confirm, but my preliminary assessment is that the collection as a whole is substantial. In this journal, she tapped the cover gently. If it's authentic, and I believe it is, it's a primary historical document. Elias Greer was a known figure in Harlan County craft history. There are 2 of his pieces in the State Museum in Nashville." Nora heard the words and absorbed them steadily, the way she absorbed most significant information, without visible reaction until she'd had time to understand what she was actually being told. "What are we talking about in terms of value?" Beverly folded her hands on the counter. "I want a full appraisal done by a qualified specialist before I gave you any numbers. But speaking as someone who's been in this business for 31 years, I don't think you should sell anything until you know exactly what you have. What I can tell you is that you should treat those objects as serious assets and handle them accordingly." Nora drove back to the farmhouse with Beverly's card and the name of an appraiser in Nashville who specialized in American folk art and historical artifacts. She had called ahead from the parking lot outside the shop and made an appointment for the following week. She had also, for the first time since leaving Memphis 6 weeks ago, allowed herself to feel something cautiously close to hope. But hope without work was just wishing. And Nora had never been a person who wished. She was a person who worked. So she worked. Every day from sunup until the light failed, she worked on the farmhouse. Because whatever the artifacts were worth, they were not worth anything yet. And the property itself was condemned and uninhabitable and would remain so until she changed that. She had the same problem she'd had since the morning of the will reading. No money, no contractors, no resources except her own hands and her own determination, and the same refusal to quit that had kept her going through 6 weeks of living in a car with 2 children. She started with the most urgent structural issues. The front porch had to be stabilized before it became dangerous. She found 4 solid timber posts in the collapsed barn, dragged them to the front of the house one at a time, and used them to shore up the porch supports. Working from a basic carpentry video she watched 3 times on her phone before attempting it. The work took 2 full days and left her shoulders aching in a way that felt permanent. But when she was done, the porch was level and solid, and the lean was gone. She tackled the boarded windows next, pulling away the plywood from inside and outside, clearing broken glass with gloves improvised from duct tape wrapped around her hands. The effect was immediate and transformative. Light poured into the ground floor rooms in a way that changed their entire character. The living room, with its high ceiling and wide fireplace, became something entirely different when morning sun came through those windows. It became beautiful. Not perfect, not finished, but beautiful in the way that honest old structures are beautiful when the light finds them correctly. The town of Millbrook began to notice her. She made runs for supplies in the rusted pickup truck she'd found behind the barn. Its engine seized, but eventually coaxed back to life with new oil and a battery she bought on credit from the auto parts store in town. People saw the truck parked at the hardware store. They saw the lights on in the farmhouse on Dustmill Road that had been dark for decades. They asked questions carefully the way small-town people do, not intrusively, but with genuine curiosity dressed up as casual conversation. A man named Carl Briggs, no relation to the law firm, was a semi-retired carpenter who had done work on half the houses in Millbrook over 40 years. He drove past the farmhouse one afternoon, saw Nora on the roof patching a section of damaged shingles with material she'd salvaged from the barn, and pulled into the drive. He stood at the base of the ladder and looked up at her for a moment. "You know what you're doing up there?" he asked. "Learning," she said without stopping. He watched her for another minute, then went to his truck and got his own tool belt. He came back and climbed the ladder. "Move over," he said. "I'll show you the right way." Carl came back 4 more times over the following 2 weeks, always unannounced, always bringing something useful: a box of roofing nails, a tube of weatherproof sealant, once a whole sheet of plywood he said he had left over from another job. He never asked for payment and deflected every time Nora tried to offer something in return. He had a daughter about her age, he said once, and left it at that. A retired schoolteacher named Bet Holloway, who lived 3 miles down the road, stopped by one evening with a casserole dish covered in foil and 2 juice boxes for the children. She said she'd heard about the woman fixing up the old Greer farmhouse, which was what the locals had always called it, and she wanted to see for herself. She stayed 2 hours, sitting on the newly stabilized porch while Chloe showed her the hand-carved wooden horse and Ben demonstrated his current expertise with the camp stove. Before she left, she pressed Nora's hand and said, "That house has been waiting for someone like you for a very long time." The Nashville appraiser, a careful and methodical man named Dr. James Whitfield, who specialized in 19th century American material culture, drove down to the farmhouse 3 weeks after Nora's call to examine the full collection in context. He spent 4 hours going through every object, photographing each one, cross-referencing against his records, making notes in a leather-bound notebook with quiet intensity. Nora sat across the kitchen table from him and watched him work. Chloe sat nearby doing homework. Ben had fallen asleep on the newly swept living room floor with the wooden horse tucked under his arm. When Dr. Whitfield finished, he closed his notebook and looked at Nora with the composed expression of a professional delivering significant news. "Ms. Callahan," he said, "I want to be precise because precision matters here. The ceramic collection is exceptional. For pieces in this condition from this regional tradition are essentially museum quality. The coin collection includes 3 coins that I would classify as genuinely rare and one that I need to send photographs to a colleague to confirm, but my working estimate is conservative. The carved figures are fine examples of Tennessee folk sculpture. The glass is period correct, and the hand-blown quality is excellent. The journal is a primary document of real historical significance." He opened his notebook to a page of figures and turned it toward her. "This is my preliminary range. Final appraisal will take several weeks and involve 2 additional specialists. But I want you to have a working number so you understand what you're dealing with." Nora looked at the page. The range Dr. Whitfield had written covered the collection as a whole. The low end of his estimate was $340,000. The high end was $480,000. Nora read those numbers twice. Then she looked up at Dr. Whitfield. He nodded once, confirming what she'd read. Outside the farmhouse windows, the Tennessee fields were green and wide and entirely indifferent to the fact that everything had just changed. She called Theodore Hawkins the following morning. She told him about Raymond's call, the nature of the argument being floated, and asked him directly what exposure she had. Hawkins was characteristically steady. The artifacts were discovered within the property after title transferred to you. They were not inventoried as part of the estate because nobody knew they existed. Under Tennessee property law, contents discovered within an inherited property after transfer of title belong to the title holder. Their claim has no merit. However, he added, that doesn't mean they won't file something anyway. People file things for reasons other than winning. They file to create pressure, to generate legal costs, to wear down someone they believe has fewer resources. Nora absorbed this. What would a defense cost? Hawkins was honest. If they file and push it to discovery, you're looking at significant fees, potentially $50,000 or more, depending on how far they take it, against a collection worth potentially nearly $500,000. It's a meaningful number. Not ruinous given what you're protecting, but real. Nora thanked him and hung up. She sat at the kitchen table in the farmhouse that Elias Greer had built in 1871 and thought about the nature of what was happening. Her siblings had laughed at her inheritance. They had offered her $15,000 for land and a structure now understood to contain potentially $500,000 in historical artifacts. They had walked away from the will reading without looking back, certain they had received everything of value and left her with nothing. And now that the nothing had revealed itself to be something extraordinary, they wanted a share of it. Not because they had earned it, not because they had worked for it or sacrificed for it or spent a single night on a cold floor believing in it, but because it existed and they didn't have it. Sylvia called 2 days after Raymond. Her approach was different, softer, more personal. She talked about their childhood, about their father, about the way families could fracture over money, and how she didn't want that for them. She used the word unfair 3 times in the first 5 minutes, each time in reference to her own situation rather than Nora's. She suggested that a voluntary sharing of the artifact proceeds, perhaps a third each, would demonstrate the kind of character their father had always hoped his children would have. Nora listened to all of it. Then she said, Dad demonstrated the character he hoped we'd have by the choices he made in his will. I'm going to honor those choices. Sylvia's softness evaporated. You're being selfish, she said. Nora didn't argue the point. I'm being clear, she said. There's a difference. She hung up and went back to work. The legal threat arrived formally 9 days later. A letter from a Nashville firm representing Raymond and Sylvia Chin jointly, asserting a claim to the artifacts on the grounds that they constituted undisclosed estate assets and requesting immediate cessation of any sale or transfer pending resolution. Nora read it twice, set it on the kitchen table, photographed it, and sent the photograph to Hawkins. His response came within the hour. Expected. I'll handle the response. Don't worry. She wasn't worried exactly. She was tired in the specific way that people get tired when they have done everything right and still find themselves having to defend it. But she had faced harder things than a bad faith legal letter. She had faced a condemned building with 2 children and $200. She had faced 6 weeks in a car in winter. She had faced a wall that needed a hammer and the courage to swing it. Whatever Raymond and Sylvia sent her way next, she would face that too, the same way she faced everything, directly and without flinching. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in late October at the Harlan County Courthouse, a solid brick building on the main square of Millbrook that smelled like floor wax and old wood and the particular institutional quiet of places where serious things were decided. Nora arrived early with Theodore Hawkins, who had driven down from Clarksville the evening before and stayed at the small motel on the highway rather than make the drive twice. He carried a leather briefcase that Nora had come to understand contained everything her father had ever said or written or communicated to him about the will, organized and documented with the thoroughness of a man who had anticipated exactly this moment. Raymond and Sylvia arrived together with 2 attorneys from a Nashville firm, both younger than Nora had expected, both carrying the careful confidence of people who had been told their case was solid. Raymond wore a dark suit and looked straight ahead. Sylvia wore gray and looked at Nora once in the hallway with an expression that seemed to want to communicate regret, but mostly communicated anxiety. Their attorneys had filed a motion asserting that the artifacts discovered at 22 Dustmill Road constituted undisclosed estate assets that had been inequitably distributed through omission. The argument rested on the claim that Walter Grimes had known about the hidden cabinet and its contents when he drafted the will and had deliberately concealed that information from the other beneficiaries. It was a constructed argument, and Nora had understood from the beginning that it was constructed. But constructed arguments filed with courts still had to be answered, still consumed time and money and energy, and that was precisely why they had been filed. The judge assigned to the matter was a woman named Honorable Ruth Deering, 60 years old, with a reputation in Harlan County for moving through cases efficiently and tolerating very little that she considered a waste of the court's time. Hawkins presented first. He was methodical and unhurried, the way Nora had come to expect him to be in all things. He submitted documentation of every meeting he had held with Walter Grimes during the drafting of the will, his own detailed notes from each session, and a signed affidavit he had prepared and had Walter sign 6 months before his death specifically addressing the Sullivan Street property. He submitted this document to Judge Deering with the explanation that Walter Grimes had anticipated a legal challenge and had taken deliberate steps to foreclose it. The affidavit stated clearly and in Walter's own words that the property at 22 Dustmill Road was being left to Nora Callahan in its entirety, including all structures, all land, and all contents therein known and unknown, and that this distribution reflected his considered and voluntary judgment made in full possession of his faculties. Judge Deering read the affidavit carefully. She set it down and looked at the attorneys for Raymond and Sylvia over her reading glasses with an expression that did not require interpretation. The opposing counsel argued that known and unknown was vague language that could not be held to cover artifacts of significant undisclosed value. Hawkins responded that known and unknown was in fact precise language, chosen deliberately to cover exactly this eventuality, and that the testator's intent could not have been stated more clearly without his having opened the wall himself and taken a photograph. Judge Deering made a sound that in a less formal setting would have been a short laugh. The opposing counsel then advanced the secondary argument, the one Nora had been dreading most. They suggested that Nora's prolonged presence as caregiver in the final years of Walter Grimes' life represented an opportunity for undue influence, and that the disproportionate nature of the bequest warranted scrutiny of the circumstances under which the will had been executed. It was the argument that turned a legal filing into something personal, the suggestion that Nora had manipulated her father, that her care had been strategic rather than genuine, that the woman who had driven 4 hours every few months and organized medications and sat through hospitalizations had done all of it to position herself for inheritance. Nora sat at the table beside Hawkins and kept her face still. She had prepared herself for this. She had known it was coming from the moment Raymond had made his first phone call on the barn roof. It still landed hard, not because it shook her certainty about what she had done and why, but because it reduced something real and human and difficult to a legal tactic, and that reduction was its own kind of cruelty. Hawkins responded without raising his voice. He submitted affidavits from Walter Grimes' physician, his neighbor of 12 years, and the staff of the rehabilitation facility where Walter had spent 6 weeks following his second stroke. Each document attested to Walter's mental clarity, his strong will, his explicit and repeatedly stated pride in Nora's dedication, and the complete absence of any indication that his decisions were influenced by anything other than his own clear judgment. He submitted records showing that Raymond and Sylvia had not visited their father in the final 2 years of his life. Not once. He did not editorialize. He simply submitted the documents and let them speak. Judge Deering reviewed everything presented with the focused attention of someone who had made a professional life of reading situations accurately. The courtroom was quiet in the way courtrooms get quiet when the outcome is becoming clear to everyone present before it is officially stated. Raymond sat with his jaw tight. Sylvia had stopped taking notes 20 minutes earlier, and was looking at the table in front of her. Judge Deering set down the last document and addressed the courtroom. She said that the claim of undisclosed estate assets was not supported by the language of the will or the documented intent of the testator. She said that the claim of undue influence was not supported by any evidence presented and was in fact directly contradicted by the substantial documentation provided by the defense. She said that the motion was denied in its entirety. She said it in the measured, final tone of someone closing a door that would not be opened again. She looked at the opposing counsel and told them she hoped their clients understood that the court's time was a shared resource. Then she moved to the next matter on her docket. Nora sat for a moment after the gavel came down. Hawkins gathered his papers with the quiet efficiency of someone for whom this outcome had never really been in question. Outside the courthouse, the October air was cold and bright, and the maples along the main square had gone fully red. Raymond and Sylvia came out a minute after Nora and Hawkins. Their attorneys were already on their phones. Raymond looked at Nora across the courthouse steps with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not calculation, not contempt, not the careful friendliness of someone working toward something. Just a man standing in the cold looking at his sister and having nothing left to say that would make any difference. Sylvia spoke first. Her voice was quiet. "I'm sorry," she said. "For all of it." Nora looked at her for a moment. She believed the apology was real, or at least as real as Sylvia could make it under the circumstances. "That matters," she said. "It just doesn't change anything." She turned and walked with Hawkins to his car. Behind her, she heard Raymond say something to Sylvia in a low voice, and Sylvia respond, and then nothing further. She did not look back. Hawkins drove her back to the farmhouse. They sat in the car in the driveway for a moment before she got out. "Your father would be proud," he said, which was the same thing he had said at the end of the will reading, and which meant more the second time. Nora nodded. She got out of the car and stood in the yard of 22 Dustmill Road and looked at the farmhouse in the October light. The windows were clear. The porch was straight and solid. Smoke from the kitchen stove's chimney rose in a clean, thin line into the cold blue sky. Inside, she could hear Ben laughing at something and Chloe's voice responding. The building was still condemned on paper. There was still so much work to do. But it was hers, completely and officially and finally hers, and nobody was going to take it. She went inside to her children. The artifact sale took place in stages over the following 3 months, handled through Dr. Whitfield's network of specialist dealers, auction houses, and private collectors who moved in the quiet and deliberate world of serious American historical objects. Nora had decided early that she would not rush it and would not accept the first offer made for anything. She had waited this long. The right buyers were worth finding. Dr. Whitfield handled the negotiations with the same careful precision he brought to everything, and Nora sat across table from collectors and dealers and museum representatives with the same steady attention she had brought to every difficult situation in her life, listening more than talking, asking questions that revealed she understood what she had, and declining offers that undervalued it without apology or hesitation. The ceramic collection sold first to a private collector in Charleston who had been looking for a complete set of regional Tennessee faux pottery for 11 years. The price was at the high end of Dr. Whitfield's range for those pieces. The coin collection was split between 2 buyers, a numismatic specialist in Chicago and a private collector in Virginia who wanted the 3 rarest pieces specifically. The carved wooden figures went to a folk art gallery in Asheville that had been pursuing examples of Tennessee sculpture from that period for a permanent exhibition. The glass bottles and the oil lamp sold through a specialist auction house in Nashville that handled 19th century American domestic objects. The journal went last and was the most deliberate transaction of all. Nora had conversations with 4 institutions before accepting an offer from the Tennessee State Museum in Nashville, which wanted it as a permanent addition to their collection of regional craft history documents. They also wanted the 2 carved figures' provenance documentation and expressed interest in mounting a small exhibition around Elias Greer's life and work. Nora negotiated the journal sale to include a named display crediting Elias Greer and the farmhouse at 22 Dustmill Road. The museum agreed without hesitation. When the final transaction cleared and Dr. Whitfield sent her the accounting summary, the total came to $418,000. After his fee and the various auction house commissions, Nora received $371,000. She sat at the kitchen table of the farmhouse where Elias Greer had once sat and looked at the number on her phone screen for a long time. It was the largest number that had ever been associated with her name in any context that was not a debt. She did not cry. She sat very still and let it become real at the pace it needed to become real. The first thing she did with the money was not what anyone expected. She did not pay off debt, though she had some. She did not buy a new car, though hers needed replacing. The first thing she did was call the Harlan County Building Department and request a meeting with the county inspector to begin the formal process of having the condemnation order on 22 Dustmill Road reviewed and lifted. She had been working on the farmhouse for months. She knew what it needed structurally, and she had the resources now to do it properly. She wanted it done right, and she wanted it done officially, and she wanted the building that Elias Greer had constructed in 1871 with his own hands to be recognized by the county that had condemned it as the sound and valuable structure it actually was. She hired Carl Briggs to oversee the renovation work, which he accepted with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had been hoping she would ask. She hired locally for everything she could, paying fair wages and taking the time to explain to each person what she was trying to preserve and why. The cast iron wood-burning stove in the kitchen was restored by a specialist Carl knew in Knoxville. The wide plank floors were cleaned and refinished by hand, every board kept original. The fireplace was repointed and the chimney rebuilt from the roofline up. The fire-damaged right side of the house was the largest undertaking, requiring new framing and new exterior walls, but Carl was meticulous about matching materials and methods to the original construction wherever possible. The barn was rebuilt over 6 weeks in early spring using timber milled from trees that had come down on the property in a winter storm, which Nora had set aside specifically for the purpose. The new barn was structurally modern, but built to look as it had looked in Elias Greer's time: board and batten siding, a gambrel roof, wide doors opening to the south. The collapsed fence along the property line was replaced with split rail, sourced from a farm 2 counties over that was clearing cedar posts from a field. The yard was cleared and planted with a kitchen garden along the south wall of the house, herbs and vegetables in raised beds built from reclaimed lumber. The same approach Nora had read about in Elias Greer's journal, where he described the garden his mother had kept in exactly that location. Bet Holloway came to see the finished farmhouse on a Saturday in late April, the same day the county inspector signed off on the lifting of the condemnation order. She stood on the front porch, which was solid and level and painted white, and looked at the house and the yard and the barn and the fields beyond with the expression of someone watching something be restored to what it had always deserved to be. "This is what it looked like," she said quietly. "In the old photographs. This is exactly what it looked like." Nora stood beside her and looked at it too. She had never seen those photographs, but somehow she had built it back to the same place anyway. The open house she hosted that evening was not planned as a celebration exactly, more as a simple acknowledgement that something had been completed and that the people who had contributed to it deserved to see what they had helped create. Carl came with his wife. Beverly Marsh from Harlan Collectibles came and spent a long time in the living room looking at the wall beside the fireplace. Now carefully repaired and repainted, the hidden cabinet removed, but its outlines still faintly visible if you knew where to look. Dr. Whitfield drove down from Nashville and walked through every room with the quiet pleasure of someone whose expertise had been part of something that mattered. Theodore Hawkins came and stood in the kitchen and said nothing for a while, and then said your father was right about you, which was the only thing Nora needed to hear. Chloe and Ben ran through the house and the yard and the barn with the freedom of children who understood without being told that something important had happened, that their lives had changed in a way that was permanent and real. Ben had claimed the left side bedroom as his own months ago and had decorated it with drawings he'd made of the farmhouse at various stages of renovation, taped to the wall in a rough chronological order that Nora found more moving than she could explain. Chloe had asked if she could keep a photograph of Elias Greer that the Tennessee State Museum had provided as part of their research, a formal portrait taken in the 1880s of a lean and careful-looking man with a woodworker's hands. It hung now in a small frame on the wall of the living room near where the hidden cabinet had been, because Chloe had said he should be able to see what happened to his house, and Nora had agreed completely. She stood on the rooftop deck she had built from reclaimed lumber at the back of the house that evening after everyone had gone, in the warm April dark with the fields invisible around her and the creek audible at the back of the property and the farmhouse solid beneath her feet. She thought about the morning of the will reading, Raymond laughing and Sylvia shaking her head and the key cold and heavy in her palm. She thought about the 6 weeks in the car and the first night on the floor of a condemned building with one blanket and 2 sleeping children and the city sounds coming through broken windows. She thought about the hammer in her hand and the wall that gave way and the objects wrapped in brown cloth on a shelf that had been waiting in the dark for 130 years for exactly the right person to find them. Her phone buzzed. A message from Raymond. It said only, "I heard it's beautiful. I'm glad." Nora read it once and set her phone face down on the railing. She would respond eventually. Maybe the apology was real enough or close enough to real that it deserved acknowledgement at some point. But not tonight. Tonight belonged to the farmhouse and the fields and the creek and the 2 children asleep inside, and the craftsman whose journal had told her that the right person would come and the father who had known, with the quiet certainty of a man who understood his children completely, exactly who that person would be. Walter Grimes had paid $9 for a condemned farmhouse and left it to the daughter everyone else had pitted. What he had actually given her was everything. Not the artifacts, not the money, not even the land. What he had given her was the chance to discover what she was made of when everything else was stripped away and all she had left was herself and a key that fit a lock that nobody else had bothered to open. She had opened it. She had walked through. And what she had built on the other side of that door, the home, the life, the proof of her own capacity, was worth more than any number Dr. Whitfield had ever written in his notebook. Nora Callahan looked out at the dark Tennessee fields and breathed in the cold spring air and felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, completely and entirely at peace. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.